Southern.
Well, I think that's pretty unfair to have to come up here and follow the drama that was unfolding before us. We did begin the video because we were told that many people who wished to attend this evening were trying to find parking spaces. But I think we've all already been moved by what we've seen in those first few minutes of the video and know that we are in for one of our most relevant and moving presentations that we've had in recent time at Salisbury University. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming this evening to be part of this very special presentation of the E. Pauline Riall Lecture Series. I'm Janet Dudley Eschbach, and I'm president of Salisbury University. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Terrence Roberts, who was one of those 9 African-American teenagers who led the way in integrating Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in fall 1957, and who now serves as the official desegregation consultant for the Little Rock School District. 50 years has passed since the Little Rock 9, as they came to be known, entered the schoolhouse door and integrated the student population of Central High School. Army troops and federalized Arkansas National Guards, as you have seen, were needed to lay open the way for these brave African-American students to take their place in that previously all-white high school. But even that manpower proved insufficient. Federal court orders and Supreme Court intervention would be needed to enforce public school integration plans in a town, a state, and a country that had been woefully slow to live up to the values of equity and justice that had long been espoused. Salisbury University's history as a traditionally white institution reveals an equally protracted acceptance of integration. And I'll speak to that for just a moment. In 1957, all Maryland colleges were segregated. Now, to current students, 1957 sounds like a long time ago, but if you stop and think about it, it wasn't so very long ago. When Dr. Ralph Bunche, a Nobel Peace Prize recipient and then Undersecretary of the United Nations, was invited to speak on campus in 1965, there was a local community protest against his presentation. As late as 1967, then Salisbury State College had enrolled fewer than a dozen African-American students. No African-American student had ever lived in the residence halls, and no African-American student had yet graduated from what was known as SSC. And change came slowly. An integrated board of trustees in 1967 required all Maryland colleges under its authority to submit meaningful integration plans for its review. Salisbury State College had already begun working collaboratively with Maryland State College of Princess Anne, which we all know today as the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, on a credit exchange program whereby students from each campus might enroll in one course at the sister school. SSC added a genuine and sustained effort to recruit faculty, staff, and students to campus. And by 1969, 3 African-American students were enrolled. A year later, 14 African-American students, representing 1% of the student population, were enrolled at our institution. By 1974, African-American student enrollment had reached 275, or approximately 10% of the matriculating students. At the same time, then president of the institution, Norm Crawford, hired a number of African American administrators for the staff of financial aid, counseling, and the academic dean's office. Dr. Crawford also hired A.K. Talbot in 1971 as the first African American faculty member in a dual appointment in education and sociology. Dr. Talbot was soon joined here at the institution by Drs. Howard Wright in psychology, Oscar Chapman in education, and Dr. Clara Small in history. I know, Clara, I know you're out there somewhere. I'll get it straight. Also hired were Wavy Gibson in English and Grady Armstrong in physical education. These were small but important steps in setting the foundation for what would become the Salisbury University of today. Since assuming the presidency of this institution in 2000, I've made the diversity among students, faculty, and staff a major initiative, not only because it is right and fair, but because the education and personal development of every member of the SU community depends upon the importance of appreciating and accepting differences and welcoming inclusion. Today, we are finally reaching a critical mass that allows minority students, particularly African American students, to feel a bit less isolated on our campus. This past fall, nearly 650 African American students were part of our educational community. Over 13% of our faculty and nearly 18% of our students are minority today. And these numbers continue to grow as students, parents, and high school counselors recognize that the excellence of a Salisbury University education is meant for every qualified and motivated student, regardless of race or national origin. It's really amazing when you see the video that was presented a few moments ago, and to think about the history of this institution and think about where our nation was just 50 years ago. On my part, I pledge that we will continue to make Salisbury University a Maryland University of national distinction so that all who are associated with it and all who are educated here can be fully proud. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Dennis Botanachik. I'm Dean of the Seidel School of Education and Professional Studies. And on its behalf, I welcome you to the Spring 2007 Riall Lecture. Most of you on campus are familiar with Carruthers Hall, and for those of you who may not know, that was once an elementary school. It was the campus demonstration school. And this lecture series is named for its principal, Pauline Riall. Every time we have a Riall lecture, I try to search out a story about Pauline Riall to give you a sense of who she was. And I have to look no further than my administrative assistant who went to kindergarten in the office where she now works. I asked Deborah today if she would tell me a Pauline Riall story. And she said, oh, we were scared of her. I said, well, was she a good principal? And she said, well, I think so. I said, did you see her a lot? She said, that woman was everywhere. She said, you'd go out in the halls and there was Miss Riall. You'd try to hide in the back of the classroom and Miss Riall would come in. She tells the story about Miss Riall observing that Deborah couldn't see very well and really sort of challenging the teacher that she hadn't figured that out yet, that she was a real student advocate, and that she was firm and she was everywhere. What better qualities for a principal, huh? A substantial bequest in Miss Riall's will provided for a continuing lecture series at Salisbury University where we could invite national leaders in education to come to this campus. That happens twice a year thanks to the generosity of Miss Riall. This gift was an important one in that it was one of the first substantial gifts to the university, and it marked the beginning stages of private giving to the university. I want to give special thanks to the Riall Lecture Planning Committee and the chair of the committee, Dr. Laura Morosco. She will introduce the other members. There are some special guests in the audience tonight. Dr. Tom Jones is our provost. Carol and Jim Powers are benefactors, friends and colleagues from the Maryland State Department of Education, many teachers and administrators from local schools, our SU faculty colleagues, and members of the community. When I look at the list of Riall lecturers, it reads like a who's who of American education. The names on the list are familiar to anyone who is a student or a scholar of education in this country. And I've decided I would limit my naming of them to 10 as the list keeps growing every year. Maxine Green, Cornell West, Jonathan Kozel, Elliot Eisner, Nell Noddings, Linda Darling Hammond, Sonia Nieto, Alfie Cohn, Herb Cole, Ernest Boyer, Carol Ann Tomlinson, James Comer. These are but a few. We are so proud to add Dr. Roberts to that list. I'm pleased to present to you the chair of the Riall Committee, Dr. Laura Morosco, who will introduce the speaker.
Thank you, and I'd like to extend my greetings to all of you as well. This evening marks the 20th anniversary of the Riall Lecture, and as you've heard, we have a real special responsibility in the School of Education to make sure that the speakers we bring to you are the top speakers in the field of education or related areas to help us all, community, students, faculty, staff, everyone at the university, the whole town and gown, to really move forward in their thinking of education in a lot of different ways. I just aside, because I just discovered this today, I have this picture. I've heard Dr. Patanachek talk about Ms. Riall on numerous occasions, and I have this picture of this elementary principal in my mind. I found her today. After the Riall Lecture, you're all invited to the reception, which is held in our social room, and if you look at the oil paintings that are hanging there, there are two women who have been portrayed, and one of them is Miss Riall. See if she doesn't look like everybody's fourth grade teacher. I also would like to extend a special welcome to a special couple who are here with us tonight. You saw in the video the Arkansas National Guard, who really were called upon to keep the Little Rock Nine and all future integration at bay. And it was President Eisenhower's decision to call in the 101st Airborne to override the state right to bring in the federal troops to make sure that those students were safe and were allowed to enter Central High School. Yesterday, I gave a news interview to the Daily Times about the upcoming lecture that Dr. Roberts is going to give this evening. And as a result of a Salisbury citizen reading that article, the husband and wife came this evening, and I would like to recognize Mr. and Mrs. David Miller. David Miller was a 20-year-old 101st Airborne who came to Little Rock to protect Dr. Roberts. Would you please stand? I've spent the last day and a half with Dr. Roberts. We have a lot of things in common. Grandchildren, we both love the Weather Channel. We both have invested our lives in education and diversity. And it's been my pleasure to spend the time with him and hear so many words from a man who, as a trained historian, one of the things that really excites me is to be in the presence of someone who's actually been a historical figure and continues to walk his talk and really demonstrate to all of us out of adversity the kinds of wonderful things that can happen with perseverance and a spirit-felt heart that moves you forward and is joyful in the world. As Dr. Roberts does his book signing, ask him if he can hum a few bars of any song. He loves music. He's a joyful person, and you can read about his entire bio in the program. But what I just want to close with about Dr. Roberts, I found this quote. It was actually a wall inscription in a New York Chinatown history project. And I'm going to read it slowly so you can really think about it. It's true that history cannot satisfy our appetite when we're hungry, nor keep us warm when the cold wind blows. But it's true that if younger generations do not understand the hardships and triumphs of their elders, then we will be a people without a past. As such, we will be like water without a source, a tree without roots. And I think this is an important message. There are lots of us in the audience who lived as young adults or teenagers during 1957 and the Civil Rights Movement. Most of you in the audience weren't even born yet. But the point is that we build on history, we learn from history. And the idea of being in contact with someone who has lived a historical event and come out whole on the other side, working for justice and equity, is a very special relationship to have. And I hope you will all take the time to actually personally meet Dr. Roberts when the Riall Lecture is over this evening. I would like to thank everyone who made this possible. Again, each year I stand up here and I'm grateful for all the people who do the technology, for all the people who cook the delicious meal that some of us are privileged to attend in the Commons. And I'd like to also talk to the horticulture people, to the facilities people, to the public relations people, to the productions people, to the people in the copy center that copied all of the programs, all of the posters, folded them. There are so many people who are involved in making this Riall series happen. It happens twice a year, and everyone comes in and it's all set to go. But it takes a lot of the community at Salisbury University to pull this off into such a meaningful event. And I'd especially like to thank the Riall Committee. If you would please stand. Drs. Ted Gilkey, Dr. Ken Miller, Diana Wagner, and Claudia Petty, and give them a round of applause. And I'll leave you with one thought. And actually, it was a committee member, Diana Wagner, this afternoon, who gave me this great quote from Andre Lorde. Revolutions are not one-time events. So I say, Little Rock 9, carry on. Dr. Roberts. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to spend some time with you this evening. I met Mr. Miller outside. I told him I'm glad he's here because I feel a little more comfortable knowing that the 101st is back on the job. You know, it's interesting because it hasn't been that long ago, by my reckoning, that all of those things in Little Rock occurred. So tonight we're going to try and figure out what we can learn together from that experience. It is in fact an honor for me to have been chosen to give this Riall Lecture. The roll call of those who have preceded me tell me in stentorian tones that I am indeed in the midst of select company. Tonight, as I begin, I bring you greetings from the other 8 members of the Little Rock 9. And in this year, the 50th year, we are in the midst of planning ceremonies, sponsoring gatherings. And we recognize that many of you present here this evening actually offered prayers on our behalf and shared the anxiety and fear that we carried with us to school every day. For that, we thank you and ask in our own prayers that God smile upon you always. Although at this juncture in space and time, it seems impossible to conceive that for a very long time, this country, our country, was convinced that separating groups of people based on racial group membership was the legal, moral, expected, desirable, and constitutional thing to do. In fact, if we were to start a timeline in the year 1619 and bring that line through time and space without stopping until we got to the year 1954, we would find a period of 335 years. We would see in stark reality a nation using its considerable powers and resources to build and maintain walls of separation between those designated racial groups. This particular way of life was underscored in 1896 in the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. The Plessy case said basically, discrimination is constitutional. Now, such a ruling was necessary because the challenges to the status quo were mounting, and the court wanted no ambiguity to cloud the thinking of American citizens. In truth, oppressed groups were not sitting idly by as the 335-year period progressed. Challenges were ever in the offing, usually to no avail. Out of those cases, one of my favorite is the Roberts versus City of Boston case from 1849, mainly because of the surname of the plaintiff. Roberts lost his appeal at the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, but he had fought long and hard to enroll his kids in the local public schools. But his kids were black, and that one fact was enough to keep them out of the halls of education. It was a series of legal protests against the apartheid of the day that led to the 1954 ruling in the Brown case. And that's the end of our timeline, 1954. The Brown case said that racial discrimination is no longer constitutional. Now let's think for a moment. 335 years juxtaposed to 53 years, that's the time we've enjoyed since the Brown decision. You sense the imbalance. You get a very clear picture of the skewed nature of that. And you can bet that if you do something for 335 years, no matter what it is, you're not going to come to a screeching halt in 1954 just because the Supreme Court says so. So even the 53-year period that we now enjoy has been vitiated by the carryover, the residuals, the institutionalized systemic veins that carry forth. That's amazing to me when we think about it, especially because sometimes people say, we have changed so much. I have recently stopped myself from responding with homicidal impulses. But I still consider it improper for people not to have an understanding of what's really going on in this country in the year 2007. We have not yet reached nirvana. Since the legal demise of discrimination and this 43-year period, we realize that there are two lines. The line started in 1619, actually continues, hopefully fading as it goes forth. A new line was started in 1954, and let's say that that new line is now growing stronger and becoming bolder as some of us tend to surmise on our better days. All of us enter the universe and step into a drama already underway. We have no hand in writing the script, but we have assigned roles to play. The unfortunate reality is that too many of us never question the role. We take that role. We accept the validity of the plot as it moves toward its expected denouement. We accept at face value the validity of the interactions between the players, no matter how skewed they are. I did question my assignment. It seemed odd that I was given a minor role, a subordinate part that left me out of the main cast. I was required to wait patiently in the wings, waiting for my cue to enter. And even when I was called, my part was so minimal, it seemed totally irrelevant to the overall dynamic. As a young black male in Little Rock, Arkansas, I was required, expected, to learn the rules of segregation and follow them without comment. And in truth, I did. As a very young kid, I didn't see that I had a choice. I didn't like it. But I learned those rules because the admonitions were, if you don't learn the rules, you might wind up dead. Black adults in my life saw my questioning as potentially disruptive. They said, keep your voice down. Don't make trouble. Don't rock the boat. It's the law of the land. Just deal with it. You're going to stir up trouble. And I would wonder, trouble for whom? It seemed to me we were in fairly serious trouble already. I didn't think the situation could get much worse. Of course, that was from the vantage point of an untutored young black boy, new to the universe and confused beyond belief. It was this confusion that eventually led me to do my own research. I wanted to make sense out of what was happening around me, and I pondered the situation for a long time, and then finally, I must have been about 9 years old, I came to a conclusion. White people are crazy. That seemed to make sense. These were the folk in charge, but look what they had wrought. But further reflection revealed no ongoing signs of mental illness, especially not present to the degree necessary for what I was witnessing. But there was, however, this penchant for making decisions predicated upon things racial. Every single decision point had a racial component. Where you could live, where you could go to school, where you could buy goods, whether you could get a bank loan, whom you could marry, whether you could ride the bus at all. And sometimes you could, but only in the back. Mental illness had to be ruled out, but I needed to know much more about this skewed system. One day, I must have been about 13 years old, I walked into a white-owned establishment in the city of Little Rock called the Crystal Burger. The Crystal Burger was a place where black people could actually enter the front door. That was quite an anomaly. But there was a very circumscribed section in the front where you could go. You couldn't go beyond that point, and you could order food, but that food had to be taken out. Food to go. We could not sit down. I go in there one summer day, and I place my order. I'll have a cheeseburger, fries, and malt to go. And then I hopped up on one of the stools. Now, I don't know to this day what prompted me to do that. It seemed like an ordinary kind of 13-year-old thing to do while I waited for my order, but it was totally against the rules of segregation. And when I did that, everything in the Crystal Burger stopped. It was as if someone had pushed the pause button on the VCR, and all the heads slowly turned in my direction. Not a word was spoken, but the nonverbal message was quite clear. Nigger, you better get some sense in your head. And I got the message. And I hopped down from the stool, canceled my order, and walked out of the Crystal Burger. That was a pivotal moment in my life. Because as I left there, filled with emotions and feelings that I can't even describe to you today, embarrassed beyond belief, angry to the nth degree, uncertain about next steps. But I knew one thing. I knew that I could no longer continue to obey the rules of segregation. It became difficult to the extreme to pay attention to those rules. My epiphany notwithstanding, however, I had no power to alter that situation. It was no doubt my coming of age in the Crystal Burger that presaged my involvement with this group of 9 who would enter Central High School. After that episode, I began to look for ways to ease the emotional pain now that my eyes were slightly more open, now that the sights were seen in vivid color, now that the words could no longer be ignored completely. There were very few remedies for the things that gnawed at my gut. In the wake of the Brown decision, the Little Rock School Board decided to obey the law. There was no precedent for that. How and why they came to that decision, no one will ever know. It's like one of those things that happen historically. You have no explanation for it, but it turns out to be a pretty helpful thing after all. The board began plans to desegregate, and they came up with a plan that makes a lot of sense. They wanted to integrate kindergarten through third grade. The problem with that plan was that everybody in Little Rock knew it would work, and they were unhappy about it. You know, it's very rare that we'll have a Fox News report about race riots in kindergarten. Doesn't happen very much. The white Southerners in Little Rock would not have it. Their explanation was, if we send our small kids into that arena without first preparing them to be racist, they might be convinced otherwise. And so they agreed to the plan that would include grades 10, 11, and 12. Virgil Blossom was a superintendent of schools. He's been quoted as having said 6-year-old children would be the least concerned about the color of the skin of their classmates. The plan, grades 10, 11, and 12, was then presented at the all-black school where I attended, Horace Mann High. A representative from the school board came, took his time explaining the plan, and then asked for volunteers. There were about 150 of us at that time who volunteered, probably 151 by actual count because I had 2 hands up at that point. Now, those numbers dwindle consistently for the next few months as a result of fear of violence, a very strict screening process developed by the school board, and concern about loss of jobs on the part of black parents and other black members in that community. Rumor has it that the school board was actually going to screen out 100% of us so that there would be the Little Rock Zero, but the NAACP got wind of that and called upon the school board to cease and desist. I don't actually know that this happened. As I said, it was a rumor. But I do know this. On the day before school was to begin, there were 10 of us. We would have been the Little Rock 10. But the father of the 10th child received a phone call from his employer. The message was quite clear. If you send your daughter up to Central High School tomorrow, don't bother coming back to work. He pulled her out. He lost his job anyway. And had he bothered to counsel with me, I could have told him that. I knew more about these folk than he realized. Most of you know the story, and you saw on the screen just now. It took the 101st Division coming in to take us to school. And the military personnel, I must say, were well-trained and highly efficient. A command decision had been made, however, not to supply them with ammunition. And I didn't know this until years later. My fallback position had always been, if things get really bad, I'll just get behind these guys and they will take people out. But even with the Army there, we were terrorized beyond belief on a daily basis. Whatever you can imagine one human being doing to another, it was done to us. We were beaten down physically and psychologically by the time that school year was over. And what always fascinated me among some of the things that happened there was the ease with which these kids could do things to us. With a sense of impunity, they kicked, shoved, slapped, tripped, spat upon, derided, sneered, belittled, and otherwise tried to make life miserable for us. The 9 of us had actually taken a vow of nonviolence that year. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had come to Little Rock in the company of Glenn Smiley, and Jim Lawson. Those 2 men helped King understand more about nonviolence. We spent some time discussing this philosophy, hearing from them. And finally, Dr. King said to us, I would like for you to seriously consider choosing nonviolence, but know this, unless you can say with honesty that you really love your enemy, it will not work. Nonviolence can only work when you can love your enemy. Well, we decided that we could. Our tormentors, however, were not people who could understand the nuances of nonviolence. They simply saw us as stationary targets, and it made life even worse for us. I'll never forget the look on the faces of the people who confronted us each day. I would replicate it here for you right now if I could, but I don't know how to twist my face to that degree. Those twisted countenances sometimes emerge out of my consciousness, and I see them again. And out of those faces spewed the vilest language you could imagine. My mom would have referred to them all as people with foul mouths. They talked about us, our parents. They knew a lot about our mothers. They were well informed about the maternal side of our families. They offered travel advice, free, non-solicited, detailed information about where we should go and how we should get there. Now, in retrospect, I can treat the whole thing with a bit of humor, but let me assure you, at the time, it was no laughing matter. There were far more serious encounters during that school year, and I had to call on all of my resources to get through those things. One of my classmates, a young man by the name of Jerry Tully, and I pause here just in case Jerry is among us. You know, I don't know where he is. It's not out of the question that he could have made his way up here to the eastern seaboard. He was a constant irritant. He had been assigned to me personally as my tormentor. And wherever I was that year, Jerry Tully was right behind me. In fact, if you ever needed to find Jerry in the school year 1957-58, all you had to do was locate me, and that was a lot easier. And then right behind me would be Jerry Tully. In the gym class, especially when we lined up for calisthenics, he'd be right behind me. Instead of doing the jumping jacks out, he would kick forward. And he would be certain that I would be tripped whenever possible, and the ball, whatever the ball was, whatever kind of ball it was, would be passed to me when I wasn't looking, even though I hadn't been assigned to any team. And all of this stuff happened in part because the 101st were not allowed to be in our classrooms. You know, sometimes people say, well, didn't you have the Army there? Well, yeah. But because the townspeople were so upset about their presence, they were restricted to a great degree. But in any case, one day we were in gym, and our coach was a Marine, ex-Marine type. He was an interesting guy. He called us all by last name. So one day he showed up there and he called us together, and he said, you know what, fellows, I'm sick and tired of you sneaking up behind Roberts and picking on him. I think you're a bunch of cowards. In fact, if you weren't cowards, you wouldn't sneak up behind him. You would walk up to him face to face and challenge him to the mat. Then he pointed to the wrestling mat. That was a shock. His coach and I hadn't worked this out in advance. Very quickly, a line formed, and Jerry Tully took his position at the head of the line. I thought that morning, in all honesty, that I was going to die. Because when I looked at those faces, again, those twisted countenances, and I understood that the coach in his He-Man approach to life would probably be of very little help to me, I said, okay, so be it. I was in my last moments on earth. It's very interesting when you face that sort of reality, at least in my case, a very strange calm comes over you. I was very, very calm as I stood there and watched this line, and I looked at Jerry Tully, and I said to myself, Tully, you're so very interested in being wherever I am just about to depart this universe. In order for you to follow me, you're going to have to depart this universe. And since I was the only one who understood the entire dynamic, I would have to be the instrument of his demise. He came at me very quickly on the mat. But because I was so calm and focused, I sidestepped him, got him down in a headlock, and he could not release himself. And he had worn that morning a set of military dog tags with a metal chain around his neck. And I quickly seized that chain as an instrument to restrict his air supply. And Tully began to choke to death. He started to turn blue and gasp for air. And the coach then ran over in a disgusted voice, said, all right, break it up, get out of here. And he shooed us outside the gym while he stayed inside the gym. Now, that was not Phi Beta Kappa, because you have to understand that something else is going to happen outside the gym as a result of what had just gone down on that mat. So we went outside, and it didn't take very long for something else to shape up. Suddenly, I was totally surrounded by all of those same kids looking at me with those faces. I'm in the middle of a circle, and the feeling of vulnerability was increased, and my fear level was going up. And I looked around the circle to see if I could ascertain what was next, and then, coming from the periphery of the circle, I saw this kid named Macaulay, forgotten his first name. Giant human being, senior football player, crew cut, no neck, you know the type. And he's got a baseball bat in his right hand, and he's walking toward me very deliberately. I don't know what to do. He's much bigger than I am. He's probably 3 times my size. I can't do a thing with him. Fortunately, Tully and I were about the same size, both a couple of skinny little kids. So I decided to make eye contact with Macaulay, and that's what I did. Laser beam locked on, and we stood there eyeball to eyeball as he approached, and he kept coming, and finally he was this close. We were there breathing on each other for what seemed like an eternity. And then Macaulay, as he waggled that back and forth, looked at me very intently, and he said, "Nigger, if you weren't so small," and he dropped the bat and walked away. And I can't tell you how dramatic that moment was. Because what happened, there I am, 1 second, I am the potential subject of a coroner's report, and then the next second, I have been liberated to live another day. But my body wouldn't move. I found out about fear in another dimension that morning. Fear will paralyze you. I could not move. Even after the group broke up and went away mumbling and grumbling to themselves, I stood there in utter fear. Then eventually, I was able to get things together and make my way back to the gym, and now the goal was to get a shower, to get dressed and get back into the routine of school, because the rules of the school were very clear that year. You always had to take PE. That was an everyday occurrence. And you had to have a shower after every PE class. That was a very regulated system with monitors. My taking a shower, however, presented real dilemmas for me. I had to contend with every single jet, as hot as the water could be turned on in my direction, and broken glass sprinkled on the floor. You know, it's very difficult to discern what is water and what is glass in that situation. But I was accustomed to managing that. I took a quick shower, then raced down to my locker. Now I made what could have been yet another fatal mistake. I forgot to maintain high-level vigilance. That was the one thing you could not do that year, was to relax vigilance. But there I was, trying to open this locker, trying to remember the numbers on the combination. While I'm fumbling with the lock, 3 or 4 students had made their way up behind me, and one of them threw a combination lock as hard as he could with great accuracy and caught me on the side of the head. And I don't know if you've ever been hit really hard on the head, but it feels like the whole world's exploding. It opened a cut. I started to bleed. I went down on one knee. And as I did that, I could hear the shuffling of feet racing toward me, and I realized in that instant if I went down, chances are I would never get up again. So I managed to maintain some semblance of balance, struggled against those lockers, and threw myself across the threshold of the coach's office. He was sitting there at his desk. He looks up, And there I am, bleeding from the head, totally naked, sopping wet. He jumps up and he runs right by me because he figured out what had happened very quickly, and he tried to catch the culprits, but they were gone. We never found out who they were. Coach came back. I got some first aid. I got dried off, and I finally opened the locker. As I opened the locker, water came cascading out. Somebody had filled that locker up to the air vent with water. Now, I am really faced with a major problem because I don't have anything to put on. Everything I would have put on is now soaking wet. Now, I can remedy this situation by making a phone call home to my mom, but the one thing I do not want to do that year is to make a phone call home in the middle of the day. Why? Well, even though my mom and I haven't discussed this, I know for a fact that she hovers over the phone, and when the phone rings, even before one ring has been complete, she has that phone up to her ear. She does not want to miss the message that tells her her son is no longer among the living. I sense this, so I hesitate. But eventually I do. I have to call. I make the call. She brings dry clothing. We make that exchange, wet for dry. And we get on about our day. 20 years later, my entire family has now moved from Little Rock to Los Angeles. And my mom and I are out having lunch. She says to me, as only she could, "Terry, do you remember that school you used to go to in Little Rock?" I said, "Well, yeah." One day, she said, somebody called me up in a very official voice and said, "Mrs. Roberts, I regret to have to inform you, but your son Terrence has been savagely beaten. A group of men with tire irons have beaten him so savagely I don't know if he'll live for another half hour." Gave her more of the gory details. She went over the edge. That was the call she feared. She somehow made her way up to the school. The principal helped calm her down some, escorted her to my classroom. She could peer in there and see that I was okay. Nothing had happened. But the psychological damage had been done. My mom told me that 20 years later that she felt devastated. Her worst fear had been realized. And yet she held that information inside. She did not tell me for fear that it would have caused me too much anguish and pain at the time. Even as she told me the story, however, I could feel the chill bumps going up my spine because I realized that I did not know the psychological cost that she and my dad had paid. It also informed me that as a parent myself, I don't think I have that same fortitude. My parents were remarkable people. I applaud them both for their willingness to confront such a system. And keep in mind, they were not social activists. They were not politically astute. They were hardworking, blue-collar people. And yet, at that moment, when I came home and told them that I had volunteered to be in this group, they saw it as a window of opportunity that probably wouldn't be open very long, and we had to go through. They saw beyond the ordinary and were ready to do whatever it took to bring order and sanity to a world crazed by its own insistence on following mythological concepts. As you learned in the intro, I have been back to Little Rock on several occasions as the desegregation consultant. You know, when that job was offered to me, I didn't think they were serious. And in fact, they weren't. They wanted me for PR purposes. They wanted to dangle me out in front of the public and say, "Hey, we're pretty good guys. We hired Terry Roberts." But I took the job anyway, with the intent of engaging in guerrilla warfare. And when I got there, I found out that a lot of my former white classmates were now working in the system. They were teachers and principals, administrators, counselors, librarians, all over the place. And they all said to me, "I didn't do it. Wasn't me." On one occasion, I was there in Little Rock Airport and a man walked up to me and he said, "Hey, you're Terry Roberts. I recognize you." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was in your PE class at Central High School." "Oh." He said, "No, no, no. I was not one of the ones beating you up. I was one of the ones watching you get beaten up." "Ah." Then he explained himself. He said he knew even at the time that he should have come to my rescue, that he should have offered some assistance, but he was afraid. He was afraid for his own life, which was quite true, and I told him I understand. We had a very healing conversation there in the Little Rock Airport. In truth, I would like to have more such encounters, but I haven't. There was one such occasion. Oprah Winfrey in 1994 invited some of us from the Nine and some of our antagonists onto the show together. And the idea was for them to explain themselves. And on the show, they all said that they were sorry and they asked for forgiveness. Interestingly enough, prior to the Oprah show, I had not heard from them. And since the Oprah show, I have not heard from them. I think it was all made for television. I think people will do a lot of stuff to appear on Oprah. So I can't put much stock in that. I learned much during that year of turmoil that has helped me to continue to navigate the racial terrain of this country. One of the more salient lessons I learned that year was that you cannot color code the universe. Not every single white person in Little Rock was my enemy. Not every single black person was my friend. I learned also that many people in Little Rock and elsewhere who believe in the sanctity of racial separation will do whatever they can do to maintain the walls of separation. My mom told me years ago, "Terry Roberts, what other people think about you is none of your business." And I think that is also a lesson that I was able to underscore at Central High School. In fact, I developed a rating scale for the insults. As the kids would hurl insults at me, I had a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not too good, 10 being very creative, and I was willing to give a mark of 10 to anybody who could come up with a creative insult. And nobody ever scored above 2. It was just too bad. I learned that year that love is a much stronger force than evil. You know, because of our nonviolent stance, I was able to put it to test several times that year. And I can tell you that there were many occasions when I was getting slapped around in the hallway, and then all of a sudden, the kid punching me could not lift his hand to hit me one more time. He, in that moment, bumped into a spark of humanity that said, you can't continue to beat up on somebody who's not going to fight back. Now, unfortunately, there were others who weren't as advanced, and I had to run. But perhaps the most important lesson to emerge from that experience is that this country has yet to find the will or the commitment to confront racism at its core. Oh, we still play games and we engage in rhetorical exchanges that substitute for meaningful substantive dialogue, but we do not demonstrate a desire to alter the status quo in ways that have meaning for the masses of people. The elite among us seem to be playing a giant game of let's you and him fight. Many at the lower socioeconomic ends of the ladder lack the sophistication to even know that they're pawns in the game. And public servants are anything but servants. As I look ahead in my attempt to make reasonable predictions about what the future might hold for us, I am alternately dismayed and delighted. Dismayed because we seem to have lost our way, and our spiritual compass has not worked for years. Delighted because at times I see the light of recognition in the eyes of young people who know that anything is possible if we want it to happen. They, the potential leaders of our wayward society, exhibit signs of willingness to cast off the mantle of non-discriminating consumerism and look for new answers to the ongoing problems we face. There are no easy answers. That much is certain. But when those who feel the impulse to engage in the search begin to prepare themselves for the task, we can expect miracles and wonders. Hyperbole, you say, perhaps, but I do believe firmly in the resilience of the human spirit. Energy can be unleashed when we agree to rearrange our mental maps to exclude all lines of separation between people, when we treat each other as peers in the universe, when we see each other as we are without need to evaluate or judge, when we choose to bear witness to truth and justice. A few months ago, I attended a lecture by Jamaica Kincaid, who spoke passionately about a number of contemporary issues. She spoke about the evils of racism and the harm caused by those who adhere to its principles. At the end, there was a question and answer session. And a young white man stood up, raised his hand, and asked, "What can I do to help?" She responded, "Young man, there is nothing you can do to help." He was crestfallen. You could see it in his eyes. She continued, "You see, what I want is for none of this ever to have happened. There's nothing you can do about that." Her words were poignant, searing, and created for me a frame of reference that contains the seeds of positive change. If all of us were to dedicate ourselves to doing those things that could lead to the development of a world unlike any we have seen thus far, perhaps Jamaica Kincaid and all those she spoke for could find ways to balance life's equations so that the past and present inequities would not loom so large. Yes, we need to know the historical antecedents because they dictate present choices and inform systemic responses. Yet, we need also to learn how to alter the course of human action so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated in the present. And we need high-level awareness about the present so that we are not confused about how the influences of the past are manifested, so our alterations are not in vain. As an example of what I'm saying here, let me share with you this insight I gained in a federal courthouse in Little Rock. As I sat there waiting my turn to testify in a school-related action, I was struck by the scene that unfolded around me as I glanced around the room. On the walls of that courthouse are the portraits of all the past justices of the court. You know, that scene was repeated for me today as I wandered into the great hall in this Holloway building. Arrayed on the wall are those same photos. There they were in their monochromatic, male-gendered reality. I sat there in the courthouse in a sort of daze because I realized in that instant that this courthouse is where fourth grade students come to learn about American justice. They sit there in the seats and the justice comes out and gives them a lecture about American justice. And as they listen to the current presiding judge, their little eyes wander around and they take in that same panorama. But nobody speaks to that. Nobody helps them explain how and why that came to be. The fourth graders leave the courthouse in a state of cognitive dissonance. Their young minds would record the scene, but there would be no accompanying explanation. They would have to figure it out for themselves. If only they knew what it was they had to figure out. I'm a grandfather now. I've got two grandsons, PJ and Austin. They live in Marietta, Georgia. And I talk to them all the time about life in these United States. The information we consider represents my attempt to prepare them for the national narrative they will most surely encounter as they enter the formal institutions of education in this country. I want them to think critically about the issues, to make healthy choices, to know that they must develop the skills to successfully navigate this terrain if they are to survive. I would prefer not to have these conversations. I would enjoy spending my time with them exploring the beauty of the universe, moving freely about the world, taking in the sights and sounds, and developing together our creative potential. At ages 4 and 1 year, it's not always easy for me to know if they understand what I'm saying. But I continue to speak my truth in their presence. Finally, as we come to a close tonight, it is my hope that you will find ways to challenge the status quo. Go naked to the mirror and ask these questions. By what action of mine was the status quo supported today? Am I willing to change what I do? My friend and colleague Eloise Klein Healy once wrote, "If what you know doesn't change you, change what you know. Go forth and learn."